In the hours that followed, Kael wrestled with the surreal. Elyra spoke in a halting pattern of the old language, with occasional references that made no sense to him. But bit by bit, the datapad built a rudimentary translation. By the time she could stand on her own, Kael gleaned the rudiments of her identity. Elyra was the last living descendant of House Varnas, an imperial lineage from centuries past, once mighty across the Helion spiral. Her family had fallen from power generations ago, undone by treachery and war. She had been placed in stasis by loyalists who believed that, someday, the rightful emperor would restore her house's dominion. Why, then, had she called Kael emperor? The puzzle grew stranger. Elyra pointed to the crest on Kael's jacket, a worn patch bearing the stylized insignia of the Belron Syndicate's top collectors. She spoke reverently, describing an emblem from her empire's lost prophecies, a hawk-like creature with wings parted, said to appear on the garment of the Chosen One. Kael's patch indeed depicted a hawk in mid-flight, though it was purely incidental for him. The Sin's hawk crest had nothing to do with alien empires and everything to do with intimidation. Yet, in Elyra's mind, this was destiny made manifest. Kael decided that the best course of action was to deliver her to the Syndicate. After all, that was his contract. Let them figure out the illusions of lost titles and forgotten genealogies. But as he read through the stasis logs, he noticed that a bizarre subroutine had been triggered upon her awakening, initiating something called the Ark Treaty Protocol. It was a kind of ceremonial bonding, an unbreakable vow that, as far as Kael could interpret, tied the rightful emperor and heir together in a marriage alliance meant to seal the future of the empire. Suddenly, Kael realized that he was not merely a bystander to Elyra's claims. He had become entangled in them. They left the station together. The environment was failing, and her survival depended on Kael's starship. Elyra followed him with equal measures of awe and wariness, unsure whether he was truly the prophesied emperor or a usurper wearing the fabled mark by happenstance. Kael couldn't decide which possibility was more absurd. As the obdurate hound pulled away from the drifting station, he sat in the pilot's seat, half listening to Elyra's attempts at speech, half trying to decide his next move. Should he take her directly to the Syndicate? Or might there be another path? His starship's navigation console flashed with new alerts. Surrounding subspace channels had become crowded with transmissions he couldn't fully decipher, referencing the Imperial Awakening. It appeared that the moment Elyra left stasis, an ancient beacon had gone active, broadcasting cryptic signals across subspace. Factions far and wide were becoming aware that something, or someone, had emerged from the shadows of the old empire. Kael wondered how long it would be until the Syndicate noticed, or worse, other powers lurking on the edges of the galaxy. Seeking answers, Kael set a course for the nearest inhabited world, Taranth V, a dusty, windblown planet serving as a trade post for travelers. He would figure out what to do with Elyra once they arrived. In the meantime, he gave her a spare bunk, provided her with basic attire from his meager clothing stash, and set his data pad to speed up the translation. At night, as the starship hummed with life, he found himself restless. He couldn't shake the feeling that the woman in the next room was something more than a relic of a forgotten monarchy. When she spoke, it was with a quiet intensity that commanded attention. Even in her confusion, there was a regal air about her. And though Kael refused to admit it, a part of him felt honored. Over the years, he had been nothing more than a dreaded collector of debts. Now, through cosmic happenstance, he was thrust into a role of unimaginable consequence. The next day, upon arriving at Taranth V, Kael guided the starship onto a landing platform caked with red dust. Elyra peered out the porthole windows in wonder. She had never seen a planet like this, though there was an echo of sorrow in her eyes as she recalled the once lush worlds under her family's rule. Kael powered down the engines, grabbed his sidearm, and instructed Elyra to stay close. If the Syndicate's informants were out and about, it wouldn't do to have her wandering off. Within the bazaar of Taranth V, hawkers and traders of every species converged to peddle wares. The air was thick with swirling grit, carried on hot winds. Kael coughed as he led Elyra through the chaotic throng. He hoped to remain inconspicuous, but fate, of course, had other plans. A group of men wearing Syndicate-issued armor approached, scanning the crowd. Kael tensed. Quickly, he pulled Elyra behind him, trying to slip between stalls. But the men spotted him. A curt voice rang out. Kael Arcanis. By order of the syndicate, you are requested to relinquish your current asset. We know you have something belonging to Renar. Kael's mind spun. Technically, the men were correct. He did have Renar's final collateral in the form of Elyra, but for reasons he couldn't yet articulate, he hesitated. Something about the syndicate's presence here felt off, a sense of darker intrigue. He mustered his calm facade. The asset in question is fragile. Where is Renar? Why is the syndicate so eager? Renar's fate is sealed. The leader of the syndicate enforcers replied, voice crackling through a helmet speaker. We're here to ensure the asset is delivered to pay the debt. His visor glinted. No one else need be harmed or aware. Kael stepped back, hand hovering near his blaster. Elyra, behind him, gripped his arm, uncertain but resolute. In her broken basic, she whispered, they are your men or your enemies? Enemies, Kael muttered, swallowing the tension in his throat. He realized with a chill that if the syndicate truly intended to use Elyra for their own ends, he might be condemning her to a fate worse than death by handing her over. We can't let them take you, he said under his breath, though the idea of defying the syndicate was tantamount to signing his own death warrant. Elyra nodded, and in her eyes, Kael glimpsed a spark. She raised her hand and made a gesture reminiscent of an ancient salute. Before Kael knew it, she barked a single word in her old language, and a surge of energy coursed through her. Some vestige of the stasis technology or an imperial artifact must have awakened her innate abilities. A wave of kinetic force rippled forward, knocking the syndicate enforcers off their feet. Merchants screamed, diving for cover as stalls collapsed under the blast. Kael didn't hesitate. Grabbing Elyra's hand, he rushed through the scattering crowds. Alarms began to blare. Overhead, hover drones buzzed. The syndicate enforcers recovered quickly, shouting commands. A burst of blaster fire seared the air. Kael ducked behind a fallen shipping crate, heart pounding. In that moment, he made a decision that would forever alter his destiny. He would not surrender this so-called heir, nor would he allow the syndicate to exploit whatever power she possessed. He didn't fully believe in the notion of ancient prophecy, but something told him that the fate of more than just himself hinged upon this choice. Elyra, stay close, he ordered, returning fire with measured shots. They needed to reach the obdurate hound and escape. Each second spent idling in the bizarre risked further entanglement. The pair broke into a sprint. Around them, shouting traitors dove out of the way. Syndicate enforcers closed in from multiple angles. One bullet scorched the edge of Elyra's sleeve, but she pressed on, her eyes shining with courage. Kael fired again, forcing back the enforcers, then dove into the starship's loading ramp. Within seconds, he sealed the hatch and scrambled to the cockpit. Engines roared to life, thrusters lighting the dusty air with bright pulses. The ship lurched upward, straining as it broke free of the docking clamps. A barrage of syndicate gunships tried to lock on, but Kael's skillful maneuvers, honed by years of chasing or fleeing unsavory individuals, allowed him to pull away. Terranth V became a swirling sphere of rust below them. Inside the cabin, Elyra struggled to steady herself against the bulkhead, still trembling from the exertion of her newfound power. Kael exhaled. He cast a sidelong glance at Elyra, who was watching him with a mixture of reverence and guilt. He took her by the shoulder. Don't apologize, he said, reading the emotions on her face. We did what we had to do. Now, we find out what comes next. Kael programmed a random series of hyperjumps to shake off any syndicate pursuit. Each jump took them deeper into uncharted regions or seldom patrolled routes. Outside the viewport, stars elongated into brilliant lines of light, then snapped back into familiar pinpricks, only for the cycle to repeat. Meanwhile, Kael tried to glean more information from Elyra. The datapad's translation engine churned away, improving steadily as it absorbed her spoken words. Over hasty meals in the cramped galley, Kael discovered that Elyra's empire, once known as the Varna's Ascendancy, had dominated a broad swath of the galaxy. According to legend, the house had harnessed advanced biotech and integrated it with a unique psionic tradition. This granted their ruling line certain gifts, which Elyra seemed to be displaying in small bursts, like the kinetic blast that knocked the enforcers off their feet. Yet the Empire's downfall came swiftly when rival factions conspired with outside forces to dismantle the ascendancy from within. Subterfuge, betrayal, and internal strife left the Empire shattered. Elyra's immediate ancestors had placed her in stasis, possibly believing she would one day reclaim the throne if the rightful emperor could be found to complete the ancient marriage protocol. Listening to her halting explanation, Kael wrestled with how improbable it all seemed. And yet, from what he had seen on Taranth V, she possessed real power. Then there was the question of the bond. She insisted Kael was now locked into an imperial role, given the beacon's activation, the stasis seal's dissolution, and the matching crest upon his jacket, even if that last detail was pure coincidence. Elyra asserted that the bond was sealed with the technology and rights of her time, and that Kael was effectively recognized, in the cosmic sense, as the new emperor consort. That notion made Kael laugh grimly. He, a battered soul used to extorting money, was to be an emperor? Still, the man in him couldn't help but admire Elyra. She was proud but kind, stubborn yet poised, and she seemed genuinely disoriented by this new galaxy. She asked questions about starship drives, about the political alliances among the current star-spanning powers, about the lost colonies that once pledged fealty to House Varnus. Kael answered what he could, though his knowledge was mostly restricted to the underworld and the Syndicate's sphere of influence. Soon enough, they both realized they needed broader expertise. There was, in the galactic rumor mill, one name that consistently emerged when it came to ancient secrets and imperial relics: Remus Haldeck, a scholar of lost civilizations, rumored to be living on the planet Astra Prime. Kael decided that might be their best lead. If Haldeck could help interpret these old texts or confirm Elyra's lineage, perhaps they could find a safe haven. The Syndicate would be slower to move in on an academic world, at least openly. So the obdurate hound changed course once again. On the journey, Kael carefully monitored communications. The subspace chatter was abuzz with talk of the Imperial beacon that had awakened. Factions from all corners, mercenaries, renegade warlords, corporate interests, and more, were seeking the source. Kael realized his time was short. Soon, the entire galaxy might be on the hunt for Elyra. He wondered if he had doomed them both by not handing her over. But in the quiet hours, when Elyra dozed in the co-pilot's seat, her face peaceful yet regal, he knew in his gut that he had made the right choice. Upon exiting hyperspace near Astra Prime, Kael felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The planet was well known for its cultural institutions, a bastion of knowledge and neutrality. Magnificent libraries sprawled across mountaintops, and advanced archaeological centers studied traces of older, forgotten empires. But such a high-profile location also served as a stage for espionage. If the Syndicate had an agent here, Kael's arrival would not go unnoticed. They descended into the planet's orbit, guided by an automated traffic control. Through the view screen, Astra Prime shimmered, a tapestry of turquoise oceans, rolling green steppes, and sprawling cityscapes built of polished stone. Kael found a landing pad near the Grand Archives, an opulent structure crowned with shining spires. Elyra stared in awe at the architectural grandeur. It reminded her, she said, of the old capital she had read about in her youth, though that capital was now dust. With cautious steps, they disembarked into the crisp air. The sun's rays danced across the tiled streets. Scholars, pilgrims, and travelers meandered between domed halls. Kael did his best to blend in, wearing a simple cloak to hide his usual garb. Elyra donned a similar cloak, though her bearing alone drew curious glances. Together, they navigated the labyrinth of corridors within the Grand Archives, searching for Remus Haldeck. They found him in a circular reading room, perched upon a stool amidst towering shelves of ancient tomes and data scrolls. He was thin, his hair a wiry white, and his eyes sparkled with the curious, fearless spirit of a researcher who had seen it all. When Kael introduced Elyra, describing her uncertain heritage, Haldeck's reaction was immediate, sharp, attentive. He whispered, "House Varnus. It's been centuries since I studied their line. If indeed you are the last scion, then you carry a legacy that once overshadowed half the galaxy. I never dreamed I might meet someone from that era." Elyra, still grappling with the modern language, simply nodded, letting Kael do most of the talking. Haldeck, for his part, led them into a hidden chamber lined with holomaps of the old star routes. He rummaged through crates of artifacts, pulling out a small data chip with archaic glyphs etched into its surface. Sliding it into a specialized reader, he summoned a swirling projection of genealogical lines and regal insignias. "Remarkable," Haldeck murmured, scanning the golden tree of House Varnus. These records track their imperial lineage from the dawn of the Helion Spiral's colonization. If your blood truly resonates with these markers, he reached into a drawer and retrieved a scanning device. Elyra, uncertain, allowed him to pass it over her wrist, wincing slightly as a tiny needle pricked her skin. The device beeped. Intricate patterns danced across its display. Haldeck gasped. The genetic markers, they match the profiles associated with the Varnas monarchy. This is no hoax. Lady Elyra is indeed of the imperial bloodline. He turned to Kael, eyes wide. But there's more. I see a second set of readings, a linked signature, as if she were bonded to someone else. You, sir? He frowned at Kael, noticing his unease. You are entwined with her genetic pattern in some way. Kael glanced at Elyra, who looked equally uncertain. So it was true. The stasis technology had formed some bizarre connection, an ancient marriage protocol, between them. Haldeck stared at them both in astonishment. This is beyond precedent. The ramifications. If word spreads, any faction seeking to resurrect or control the old empire's resources could try to claim you. And if your bond is recognized under those old laws, then you, Kael, are effectively the emperor consort, at least by the traditions of House Varnus. Kael felt his pulse hammer. I never asked for this, he muttered, pacing across the chamber. I'm a nobody who collects debts. My only plan was to hand her over to the syndicate, until I realized they'd probably exploit her or kill her. Now I've got the entire galaxy after us. I need options, Haldeck. The scholar stroked his chin. There is an old seat of power, he said slowly, a fortress world called Orion. It once served as a key bastion for House Varnus. If any of its automated defenses remain active, they might still respond to the rightful heir, or the recognized emperor, by extension. You could lay claim to the planet, gather whatever is left of the Empire's arsenal, and protect yourselves long enough to chart a real path forward. Elyra's eyes brightened. She understood enough to piece together the gist. Orion is rightful seat, she said in her halting basic. Place of power. Haldeck nodded gently. Kael sighed. Traveling there is likely dangerous. If the Syndicate or other powers suspect we aim to reconstitute an old empire, they'll throw everything they have at stopping us. But I see no other choice. Haldeck rummaged further, producing a star chart showing coordinates in a remote region. Orion orbits a white dwarf star near a dense nebula. It's not on the main trade routes, which might buy you some secrecy. I can help fabricate new transponder codes for your ship, at least giving you a fighting chance. But you must be wary. Old Imperial records mention advanced defensive grids, sentinel drones, maybe even subspace wards. You'll need the rightful heir's genetic key to gain entrance. That, presumably, is Lady Elyra's role. Kael studied the chart, feeling the weight of this new responsibility crush him. He needed to ensure Elyra's safety. He had no illusions of truly becoming an emperor. This was simply survival. Yet when he glanced at Elyra, he saw a glimmer of hope in her expression. For her, this was the beginning of a possible restoration, a chance to reclaim the dignity lost by her ancestors. And though Kael would not readily admit it, a small part of him was stirred by the idea of forging a better legacy than the bleak one he'd known. Before leaving, Haldeck insisted on giving them an ancient signet ring once worn by House Varnus princes, an artifact which might serve as a control token for Imperial machinery. Elyra accepted it with reverence, slipping it onto her finger. Despite its archaic design, it adjusted to fit snugly, as if acknowledging the rightful heir. Kael thanked Haldeck, ignoring the scholar's parting comment. Beware the illusions of grandeur, my friend. Empires often rise and fall by the pride of those who wear the crown. Kael and Elyra departed the planet that evening, using the newly forged transponder codes. Haldeck's efforts seemed successful, as they evaded unwanted attention for the time being. Yet Kael's nerves were on edge. As they soared into hyperspace, heading for the coordinates of Orion, an ominous hush descended upon the ship. Unbeknownst to them, hidden watchers had monitored their movements. In the shadows of Astra Prime's orbit, a sleek vessel with black hull plating trailed after them, scanning the warp signature. Inside that vessel, a cloaked figure relayed information to a distant overseer. The hunt was on. The Citadel's automated defense system roared to life, launching high-energy pulses and interceptors into the skies above Orion. From vantage points around the central courtyard, turrets rose, their muzzles humming with built-up charge. Over the plains, ancient war drones took flight, sleek metallic constructs that had lain dormant until an heir of House Varna's returned. Kael monitored the external feed from the throne room console, watching as the Syndicate dropships attempted to dodge plasma beams. One ship veered left, but a well-aimed shot tore through its engines, sending it spinning to the surface in a fiery trail. The other ships broke formation, circling around to seek a less defended approach. Kael had to grudgingly admit that the old Empire's technology was formidable, especially with a living heir at the helm. Elyra stood, one hand pressed against a biometric panel, eyes closed in concentration. Through some combination of her genetic key and her psionic skill, she was guiding the automated defenses, orchestrating the Citadel's response. Despite their efforts, at least one dropship managed to land in a barren field just beyond the Citadel walls. Syndicate enforcers disembarked, their numbers bolstered by heavily armed mercenaries. Kael realized that a ground assault was imminent. "We have to hold them off," he said, checking his blaster. Elyra nodded, though Kael wasn't sure how well she could handle direct combat. She had proven her abilities once, but the use of her psionic power left her visibly drained. A clang echoed through the corridors. Lights flickered, signaling intruders within the Citadel's perimeter. Kael left Elyra at the throne console, urging her to maintain control of the overall defenses, and sprinted down a hallway that led to the outer ramparts. There, through tall windows, he saw the Syndicate forces scaling the ancient walls using grappling cables and portable jump jets. The war drones had taken to the skies, focusing more on the inbound ships, leaving the ground infiltration only partially covered. Taking cover behind a decorative column, Kael unleashed a flurry of blaster bolts at a squad of Syndicate troopers climbing over the parapet. They returned fire, their shots ricocheting off the stone architecture. Fragments of ancient reliefs crumbled. Kael ducked low, cursing under his breath at the irony of fighting, once again, the very group he had served for so long. He might have recognized some of them, a disquieting thought. The Syndicate rarely forgave betrayal. If captured, Kael's fate would be worse than death. Suddenly, a swirl of static crackled in his ear. Someone had sliced into his comm frequency. A familiar voice, cold as vacuum, sliced through the interference. "Kael Arcanis," it said. "I am Tarsis Velar, senior collector of the Belron Syndicate. You've gone rogue. Bring out the girl, and we might show mercy." Kael gritted his teeth. Tarsis Velar was a name he knew all too well, a rival known for cruelty and cunning. "I don't answer to you, Tarsis." Kael spat into the comm, returning fire as another trooper attempted to breach the window. "You want her? Come take her, if you can." He severed the connection, ignoring the next wave of threats that hissed in his earpiece. More troopers reached the ramparts, pinning Kael down. He adjusted his position, searching for an advantage. Suddenly, a bright flash of light filled the corridor. Elyra had arrived. Standing on a balcony overlooking the courtyard, she raised a trembling hand, channeling a burst of psionic energy that staggered the advancing troops, sending them sprawling backward. Kael seized the moment, dispatching several with precise shots. Elyra wavered. Kael ran to support her, guiding her behind a column. "You shouldn't leave the console," Kael said breathlessly. "The Citadel needs your commands." Elyra's breath came in labored heaves. She gestured wearily, indicating that some of the systems were now automated, enough to keep the skies clear for a time. But she realized the ground assault required a more personal touch. The fight raged for what felt like hours, though it was likely only minutes. Syndicate troopers poured into the outer courtyards, exchanging fire with drones and hidden turrets. Dust clouds choked the air. Kael and Elyra moved strategically through the labyrinthine corridors, ambushing smaller squads and sealing off passages with ancient gates. Twice, Elyra's psionic blasts saved them from being overwhelmed. Each time, Kael saw it took a toll on her, draining her energy. Still, She pressed on, compelled by an ironclad resolve that only deepened Kael's respect. At last, they reached the main courtyard, near the starship that had brought them here. Bodies of troopers and war drones lay strewn about, the result of the intense battle. A swirling haze of smoke dimmed the overhead glow. In the midst of the debris stood Tarsis Velar, clad in reinforced battle armor. His faceplate reflected the flickering lights of the damaged citadel. He held a high-capacity energy rifle in one gauntlet hand. "Kael," Tarsis called out, voice amplified by the helmet. "Enough games. The Syndicate will pay me a fortune for that girl. More than enough to settle any old grudges I have with you." The muzzle of his rifle was trained steadily at Elyra. "Hand her over." Kael stepped forward, his heart hammering. "She's under my protection," he replied. "You'll have to kill me first." He felt Elyra's grip on his arm, a silent entreaty to be cautious. Tarsis's lip curled. "That can be arranged." In a lightning-fast motion, he squeezed the trigger. A searing bolt of plasma shot forward. Kael threw himself in front of Elyra. Pain flared in his shoulder as the shot grazed him. He bit back a cry, firing his own blaster at Tarsis. The shot went wide, scorching the courtyard stonework. Elyra snarled, a raw anger blooming in her eyes. She stepped past Kael, ignoring his protest, and raised both hands. The air around her shimmered with electric blue psionic energy, forming a swirling vortex. Tarsis unleashed another volley of plasma bolts, but they dissipated as they struck the shimmering field. Then, with a surge of power, Elyra directed the vortex toward Tarsis, who slid backward across the ground, armor sparking as it ground against the stone. His weapon flew from his grasp. Kael darted forward, ignoring the stab of pain in his shoulder, and aimed his blaster at Tarsis's helmet. Tarsis lay pinned, half immobilized by Elyra's invisible force. The Collector glared up at Kael with pure hatred. "Go on," he taunted, voice muffled by the visor. "Finish it. You know I'd do the same to you." A cold sweat broke across Kael's forehead. The old Kael, Syndicate Kael, might have pulled the trigger without hesitation. But he hesitated now, the significance of the moment weighing heavily. Elyra looked at him, eyes reflecting sorrow rather than vengeance. Kael took a breath, pressed his blaster to Tarsis's chest plate, and said, "Get out. Take your mercenaries and go. Don't come near us again." Tarsis spat a curse, but Kael stepped back, releasing him. Elyra eased her hold, and the vortex dissipated. Tarsis staggered to his feet, retrieved his weapon, and limped off toward a half-functioning dropship. Meanwhile, the surviving Syndicate forces, seeing their leader retreat, scrambled to evacuate. Drones continued to harass them, but Elyra signaled the Citadel defenses to allow an escape corridor. Kael watched them go, blood pounding in his ears. He had just defied the Syndicate in the most absolute way. There was no turning back. As the last of the dropships vanished into the sky, leaving scorched wrecks of their companions behind, a hush fell over Orion. Kael let out a shuddering breath, leaning against a broken column. Elyra rushed to his side, concern plain on her face. She reached out, gingerly touching the wound on his shoulder, and a faint glow of psionic energy coursed from her palm. The pain ebbed, replaced by a gentle warmth. Kael blinked in amazement. "You heal too?" he asked, voice rough with fatigue. Elyra managed a small, tired smile. "A little. My mother taught. Not perfect, but enough." Kael nodded, appreciating her kindness. Together, they surveyed the aftermath. The grand courtyard lay littered with debris, but the citadel still stood, battered yet unbowed. Standing there in the settling dust, Kael felt a sudden surge of something foreign, pride. He had defended a place, a person, rather than tearing it down or exploiting it for profit. Elyra slipped her hand into his, her posture regal despite her ragged breathing. In the days that followed, Orion fell into a somber, purposeful rhythm. Elyra spent long hours learning to interface with the Citadel's systems, reactivating sections of the fortress world that had slumbered for centuries. Though the planet remained mostly barren, pockets of advanced infrastructure flickered back to life. Fabrication facilities, medical bays, even an agricultural dome. All were keyed to her genetic code. And at every turn, those facilities recognized Kael as well, as though the technology accepted him as Emperor Consort. Kael, still nursing the partial burn on his shoulder, adapted quickly. With a mixture of trial and error, He coordinated with Elyra to train the awakened war drones in patrol patterns, set up sensor nets around the planet's orbit, and begin repairs on the battered sections of the Citadel. Once, he would have scoffed at the idea of playing caretaker to a half-dead empire. Yet, there he was, rummaging through centuries-old manuals to figure out how to coax the archaic technology into action. Interestingly, the planet itself seemed to harbor hidden resources. Deep beneath the Citadel, a massive library of data crystals lay stored in vaults, each one preserving knowledge from the Empire's golden age, schematics for starships, designs for medical breakthroughs, treatises on governance, and more. Elyra insisted on exploring those vaults, sometimes losing herself for hours among the data, emerging with wide eyes and excited talk of what the Empire might accomplish if resurrected. Kael could not help but worry about the attention such an endeavor would draw. Already, they had bested one syndicate assault, but others would follow, and not just from the syndicate. His suspicions were confirmed when, late one evening, the Citadel's sensors picked up the arrival of a small, unidentified shuttle near the edge of Orion's atmosphere. It did not appear hostile, no weapon signatures or formation flights. Elyra and Kael watched from the command console as the shuttle transmitted a polite request for landing. The occupant identified themselves as Daska, envoy of the Soterian League, a minor power in the galaxy's political tapestry, known for advocating neutrality and diplomacy. Should we allow them? Elyra asked, her expression wary yet hopeful. Kael debated. Allowing any outside party to land was a risk, but ignoring the shuttle might forfeit a chance to establish peaceful ties. Finally, he nodded. Bring them down, but keep the defense drones on standby in case it's a trap. Daska turned out to be a slender, unassuming man with silver-streaked hair, clad in the understated regalia of the Soterian League's diplomatic corps. He bowed respectfully upon meeting Elyra. With a courteous smile, he said, "My lady, word has spread that someone has awakened the old Varnish stronghold. The Soterian League has come not as an enemy, but to propose an alliance, or at least an understanding. We know the Syndicate tried to seize you. We stand against their tyranny." Kael eyed Varen with suspicion, mindful that flattery could mask hidden agendas. Elyra, however, engaged him in conversation. Their words jumped between basic and a translation matrix for her older dialect. By the end of the discussion, Varen revealed that the Soterian League believed House Varnaz's return could disrupt the power balance in the galaxy in a beneficial way, potentially dethroning oppressive syndicates and warlords. The League offered minimal but valuable support, trade connections, small shipments of supplies, and safe passage through their territory, should Elyra wish to re-establish House Varnaz. In exchange, they only asked that House Varnaz honor Soteria's neutrality and possibly lend aid against shared foes in the future. Kael allowed himself a faint measure of hope. Maybe not everyone sought to exploit or destroy them. The meeting concluded with Daska presenting a token of goodwill, a sealed container of advanced medical supplies, and a secure communication channel for direct contact with the Soterian capital. Elyra accepted graciously, performing a short bow in the manner of her ancestors. The envoy departed soon after, leaving a ripple of possibility in his wake. As they watched his shuttle disappear among the swirling clouds, Elyra turned to Kael, her voice soft. "We can have allies," she said. "Not only enemies. The Empire can be good." Kael nodded, though he remained tense. The galaxy was vast, and for every ally, there were a dozen predators lurking. The question was whether they could gather enough support to defend themselves before those predators closed in. Indeed, over the next several weeks, the obdurate hound carried Kael and Elyra on discreet trips across nearby systems. Each venture had a purpose, either to collect supplies, gather intelligence, or reach out to potential sympathizers. Rumors spread quickly. The lost heir of House Varnaz was forging a new empire, aided by a mysterious emperor consort who bore the hawk crest. Some saw this as a chance for renewed order. Others denounced it as a threat to existing power structures. Kael found himself navigating a delicate balance, engaging in diplomacy while avoiding open warfare with bigger factions. Through it all, the bond between Kael and Elyra deepened. They moved in tandem, discussing strategy late into the night, sharing the burdens of leadership in the hush of Orion's ancient halls. Elyra's linguistic skills improved rapidly, and Kael found himself teaching her the subtleties of modern galactic culture. He discovered she possessed a keen political instinct, tempered by genuine compassion for the weak and downtrodden. In contrast, Kael's cynicism and streetwise perspective provided a counterbalance, protecting them from naive trust. Inevitably, the scale of what they were doing drew the attention of major players. Reports trickled in of the syndicate regrouping for a larger offensive. Pirate clans whispered about capturing the Imperial heir. Corporate conglomerates debated the economic advantages of controlling Orion's resources. Even the Ascendant warlords, a loose alliance of militarized rulers, began to circle like sharks. Kael knew a grand confrontation loomed. One night, he found Elyra in the Citadel's grand library, lost in thought. She studied a star map etched on a marble table, marking the coordinates of old Empire outposts. "We cannot stand alone," she said quietly, sensing his presence. "We need more than the Soterian League's small offer. We must rebuild House Varna's, gather those who will follow. Show them we are worthy." Kael approached, resting a hand on her shoulder. "It won't be easy," he said. "We have no recognized claim outside these crumbling walls, except for your bloodline. The galaxy won't just kneel to that." She looked up at him, unwavering. "I do not wish them to kneel. I wish them to stand by our side." In that moment, Kael realized how far he had come from the lone debt collector. He felt oddly grateful for Elyra's idealism. It kept a spark alive in him that he thought had died long ago. Through painstaking negotiations and covert transmissions, Kael and Elyra managed to assemble a small coalition. Disaffected border worlds, a few ex-military captains longing for a more just order, and some intrepid merchants hoping to profit from a stable region. They met on Orion, forging fragile pacts in the echoing halls of the Citadel. Elyra presided over these meetings with graceful resolve, appealing to the shared desire for a galaxy free from oppression. Kael handled the practicalities, logistics, security, and ensuring that no spies infiltrated their gathering. Despite his vigilance, betrayal crept in. One starship captain, introduced to them by a neutral broker, was in fact an agent of the Ascendant warlords. On the third day of the summit, an alert blared across the Citadel's sensors. The planet had been marked with a tracking beacon, and a formidable fleet, bearing the warlord's insignia, was dropping out of hyperspace. The Citadel's defenses, though formidable, could be overwhelmed by a large enough force. Kael quickly identified the traitor, but the damage was done. The Ascendant warlords launched an orbital bombardment, methodically testing the strength of Orion's protective shields. Chaos erupted within the Citadel. Coalition delegates panicked, their illusions of safety shattered by the rumble of thunderous blasts overhead. Elyra took immediate action, coordinating with the Citadel's systems to reinforce the planetary shields. Kael mobilized the war drones, positioning them to intercept ground troops if the warlords attempted a landing. The fortress shook as kinetic energy rained from orbit, but the shields held for the moment. Desperate for a diplomatic reprieve, one of the delegates proposed surrender. "We cannot fight a fleet of that size," he insisted. "We must open negotiations, or they'll reduce Orion to slag." Others, emboldened by Elyra's vision, refused to yield. Tensions ran high. Elyra tried to reassure them, but her own anxiety was clear. She turned to Kael. "We need to show them we are not powerless," she whispered, eyes flicking toward the star map that displayed the warlord's ships in ominous detail. In a flash of insight, Kael proposed a bold plan: deploy a hidden subspace disruptor stored in Orion's vaults. If activated at close range, it might disable the warlord's jump drives and shielding arrays, forcing them into a precarious standoff and leveling the playing field. But to do so safely, someone needed to place a beacon on one of their capital ships, an almost suicidal mission. Elyra looked at Kael with alarm. "It is too risky. You cannot." Kael held her gaze, a softness in his voice. "It's the only way. If I can slip aboard and tag their main ship with the disruptor beacon, we might avoid a full invasion. They'll be forced to retreat, or be stranded with no reinforcements." He swallowed the fear building in his chest. "Trust me." She said nothing for a long moment, but then nodded, eyes brimming with unspoken words. Kael gently squeezed her hand, then turned to the coalition delegates, giving brisk instructions on fortifying the Citadel in his absence. Elyra accompanied him to the hangar, where the obdurate hound sat, still bearing the scars of past battles. He climbed into the cockpit, steeling himself for what lay ahead. "Return," she said softly, standing near the open ramp. Return as Emperor. I need you. Kael gave a crooked grin. I'll be back, Empress, he replied, using the title for the first time, seeing her cheeks color in the flickering light. The ramp sealed. The ship lifted off, threading its way through the battered planetary shield. The moment Kael cleared the atmosphere, warning klaxons blared. Missiles streaked by. He jinked left, weaving through a chaotic barrage. The warlord's vessels formed a blockade, bristling with cannons. Kael relied on every trick gleaned from his collector days, flying in evasive patterns, cloaking his energy signature. Slipping behind a piece of drifting debris, he launched a flurry of decoy drones. Then, with a burst of thruster power, he angled straight for the warlord's flagship. Blaster turrets lit the void, but the obdurate hound evaded them with surprising grace, as if spurred by Kael's fierce will to protect Elyra and the future they were forging together. Finally, he found a narrow docking port on the flagship's underbelly and executed a risky maneuver, attaching to the hull with magnetic clamps. The starship's autopilot kept them locked in place. Kael donned a vacuum suit, stowed the disruptor beacon in a compact harness, and stepped into the airless darkness. With careful precision, he placed the device near a critical communications array, hooking it into the flagship's power conduit so the beacon could broadcast the disruptor signal once activated. All the while, the capital ship's sensors scanned, dangerously close to detecting him. His heart hammered, each second a precarious gamble. If discovered, he'd be space dust. His luck ran out. An alarm blared, and the hull's external sensors swiveled in his direction. Magnetic clamps threatened to disengage as the flagship's weapon pod started to rotate. Kael forced himself to remain calm, finishing the final connection. A patrolling fighter swooped dangerously close, but didn't see him. Kael triggered the disruptor's timed sequence, giving himself 2 minutes to escape. Then he launched from the hull, using a tether to swing back toward the obdurate hound. Another alarm shrieked. This time, a turret locked on, spewing molten plasma. Kael jetted sideways, narrowly avoiding incineration. His tether reeled him in. He scrambled aboard and sealed the airlock. With no time to lose, he disengaged from the warlord's flagship and hurled the obdurate hound into a wild spiral, weaving past interceptors. 1 minute left. Kael hammered the thrusters, pushing the engines into the red. The blockade loomed, but a lucky break in their formation let him slingshot around a cruiser. 20 seconds. Suddenly, a bright burst illuminated the void behind him. The disruptor beacon had gone live, lashing the warlord's ships with subspace interference. Kael whooped in triumph as he saw the blockade's ranks falter, jump drives sparking out of commission. Their shield generators hiccuped, exposing them to the Citadel's orbital cannons. Orion seized the opening. Streams of turquoise energy lanced upward, striking the vulnerable capital ships. The warlords panicked, uncertain whether to retreat or press the attack without their jump capabilities. Soon, chaos broke out in their formation. Some ships retreated to a safe distance. Others attempted emergency repairs. Kael soared back to the planet, adrenaline pulsing. He had turned the tide. Upon his landing in the Citadel's hangar, Elyra was there, flanked by a relieved group of coalition delegates. Kael descended the ramp, shoulders sagging with exhaustion. Elyra ran to him, throwing regal decorum aside, and he caught her in a tight embrace. For a moment, no words were needed. Cheers and applause erupted from the onlookers, echoing against the high stone walls. The warlords, battered and disorganized, eventually withdrew their fleet. The siege ended, leaving Orion standing victorious yet again. Though the triumph was hard-fought, the cost was clear, resources were depleted, defenses strained. The coalition held firm, galvanized by the show of strength. But Kael knew the respite would be brief. The Syndicate, the warlords, and countless others would keep pressing. Their only chance lay in forging something truly lasting from House Varnaz's legacy. Some days later, while rummaging through the sealed vaults in search of additional defensive measures, Elyra discovered an ancient object of great significance, the Scepter of Unis, a symbol of unity once wielded by the Empire's monarchs. An imposing, rune-engraved staff, it was rumored to possess an advanced psionic amplifier. With it, an emperor or empress could link minds across vast distances, or so the legend claimed, facilitating empathy or imposing control. Elyra showed it to Kael, her fingers tracing the intricate glyphs. This could unite our allies in a deeper bond, she explained. Or, it could be used to force compliance. That is why it was sealed away when my ancestors fell, lest it be misused. Kael studied the scepter warily. Power like that seldom ends well, he said. Yet he recognized its potential. The coalition needed a unifying symbol, a rallying beacon, and the scepter might fulfill that role. Elyra, sensing his hesitation, promised she would use it only for the good of their cause. Kael trusted her, albeit cautiously. Word spread of the scepter's rediscovery, and soon envoys arrived from other factions, some truly seeking peace, others hoping to manipulate the situation. Elyra handled the delicate negotiations, always mindful of the moral responsibility she carried. Kael served as her advisor, quietly discouraging any suggestion that the scepter be used to control unwilling populations. Over time, pockets of the galaxy began to see House Varnas as a beacon of stability. A few minor worlds even pledged formal allegiance, swearing loyalty to Elyra and Kael. The outlines of a fledgling empire started to emerge. Still, the specter of the Syndicate loomed large. Their humiliating defeat at Orion had only stoked their resolve. Every intelligence report suggested they were forging new alliances, stockpiling weaponry, and planning a decisive strike. Meanwhile, Kael discovered that Tarsis Velar had risen in rank, presumably after eliminating internal rivals. The next time they met, it would not be a minor skirmish. Late one night, Kael stood on a balcony overlooking the plains, lost in thought. The citadel's lights cast a comforting glow behind him. Elyra approached, the scepter of Eunice in her hand. She placed it gently against the stone ledge, turning to Kael. "This is bigger than us," she murmured. "We stand on the cusp of restoring something that died centuries ago. But I do not want to become like those who betrayed my ancestors, hungry for power." Kael wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "If we're careful, we can forge a different path," he said. "We've already defied the Syndicate. We've shown them we won't be prey. We can do the same for the rest of the galaxy, but we have to hold on to who we are." Elyra nodded, leaning into him for warmth. In that quiet moment, Kael felt an unexpected emotion flood him: love. A love forged in shared danger, blossoming in the ashes of an empire reborn. He quietly vowed he would protect Elyra, no matter what it took. In the weeks that followed, tensions reached a boiling point. The Syndicate, in league with a fragment of the Ascendant warlords and several opportunistic pirate clans, assembled a massive armada. Their plan was to launch a coordinated strike, bombard Orion into submission, and seize the scepter of Eunice. House Varnas's coalition responded in kind, rallying under newly built banners. Diplomatic overtures with the Soterian League bore fruit. A small but potent task force offered to aid Orion. Veteran captains from various frontier worlds contributed to the defense. Even pockets of the warlords, resentful of their faction's partial alliance with the Syndicate, chose to side with Elyra, seeing in her a chance for a more honorable galaxy. On the eve of the decisive battle, Orion's orbit filled with starships. A tension lay thick in the atmosphere. Kael donned a suit of combat gear adapted from the old Empire's designs. Elyra wore regal attire, blending the fashions of her era with modern sensibilities, the scepter in her hand. Standing before a gathered assembly in the grand courtyard, she offered words of courage. Kael, beside her, projected a calm confidence. They were two halves of a single destiny, an unexpected emperor and empress, forging a new order from the ruin of old ambitions. When the Syndicate armada emerged from hyperspace, the clash was immediate. Ion cannons streaked across the void, starfighter squadrons engaged in deadly dances, and capital ships exchanged titanic broadsides. The day turned to night as the sky above Orion flared with energetic discharges. In the Citadel's command center, Elyra orchestrated the planetary defenses, while Kael led the coalition fleet in orbit, coordinating tactics from the bridge of a newly retrofitted warship, the Resolute Dawn. Through skillful maneuvers, they held their ground, but the Syndicate's numbers were daunting. Tarsis Velar's flagship, bristling with advanced weaponry, tore through coalition lines. One by one, Allied vessels buckled under the relentless assault. Over the comm, Kael heard captains calling out for reinforcements, their voices laced with desperation. He clenched his fists, urging them to hold position. If they broke rank, the entire formation would collapse. Suddenly, a massive dreadnought, allied with the Ascendant warlords, appeared at the fringe of the battlefield. Its cannons unleashed a barrage that hammered Orion's shield grid. Alarms filled the citadel. Elyra poured her focus into stabilizing the defenses, each blast testing the planet's protective layer. Meanwhile, the Soterian task force arrived to engage the dreadnought, but they too found themselves outgunned. In a decisive moment, Tarsis Velar's flagship launched a direct assault on the resolute Dawn, hoping to decapitate the coalition by eliminating Kael. Laser fire raked the hull, sparking chain reactions in the engine rooms. Kael felt the deck shudder beneath his boots. Crew members scrambled at their stations. The enemy was closing in, determined to end this rebellion once and for all. A voice crackled over a private channel. Tarsis himself. Kael, you can't escape your past. Did you really think you could become more than the Syndicate's hound? Surrender the Empress, the scepter, and yourself. Maybe I'll spare this planet. Kael's temper flared, but he steadied himself. He realized Tarsis was fixated on the old Kael, the collector who only cared about debts. But that man was gone. Not this time, Tarsis, Kael replied, cutting the line. With desperate resolve, he ordered the resolute Dawn on a collision course with Tarsis's flagship, hoping to force a point-blank engagement where the Empire's advanced weaponry could tip the balance. They closed the distance. Explosions tore through the resolute Dawn's corridors. Kael braced for impact, eyes locked on the image of Tarsis's ship filling the view screen. Then, in a flash of brilliance, the planetary shield parted, and a concentrated beam of azure light shot forth, channeled directly from Orion's core. Elyra had used the scepter's amplifier to route the planet's defensive power into a single, focused strike. The beam shredded Tarsis's shield generators, leaving his flagship vulnerable. Kael seized the moment, unleashing a full salvo of plasma torpedoes at close range. The resulting explosion tore the flagship apart, scattered debris blazing across space. With Tarsis gone, the Syndicate Armada lost its central command. Some captains tried to rally, but the battle was turning in House Varnas's favor. The Soterian task force pressed the advantage, crippling the dreadnought. Pirate clans, seeing defeat on the horizon, fled. Within hours, the remains of the Syndicate forces were in full retreat, chased into hyperspace by the triumphant coalition. The final threat to Orion dissolved, leaving behind wreckage and an unexpected calm. In the aftermath, Kael returned to the Citadel. He found Elyra in the throne room, kneeling from exhaustion, the scepter clutched in her trembling hands. She looked up, tears sparkling on her lashes. "We did it," she whispered. Kael approached, kneeling beside her. All the tension of the battle, the fear, the heartbreak, melted away in that moment. He wrapped his arms around her. "Yes," he said softly, "we did." She smiled, relief flooding her features. Around them, the Citadel's luminous architecture cast gentle shadows, as if bowing in respect to the Emperor and Empress who had defended it so valiantly. Months passed. The galaxies slowly adjusted to the new reality. House Varnas, once thought lost to myth, stood resurrected on the fortress world of Orion, strong, yet tempered by the lessons of the past. Elyra and Kael worked tirelessly to secure lasting peace among the coalition members, forging alliances grounded in mutual respect. The Scepter of Eunice, while a potent symbol of imperial heritage, was used sparingly, with Elyra insisting that trust had to be earned, not coerced. In the wake of the Syndicate's defeat, many of its branches dissolved or joined competing powers. Those that remained either avoided House Varnas or sought new contracts that didn't challenge the growing empire. Tarsis Velar's demise had dealt a significant blow to the Syndicate's upper ranks, allowing smaller factions to claim territory. Kael knew that the galaxy's underbelly would never be fully free of criminal enterprises, but he took quiet satisfaction in knowing the Syndicate no longer loomed as a threat to Orion. Within the Citadel, life blossomed anew. Engineers restored hydroponic gardens, turning once sterile courtyards into green havens. Families and refugees from war-torn regions found sanctuary under House Varnas's banner, rebuilding their lives within the planet's protective shield. The coalition recognized Elyra as the rightful empress, but her rule was shaped by empathy and cooperation rather than raw dominance. At Elyra's side, Kael served as her consort, advisor, and, though it still made him smile to say it, her husband. Their bond, sealed by ancient stasis protocols, had deepened into genuine devotion. One crisp morning, as the twin suns of Orion's system rose over the horizon, Kael and Elyra walked hand in hand through the Citadel gardens. Flowers not seen for centuries now flourished in carefully curated plots. The wind carried a mild fragrance, a promise of renewal. In the distance, new structures rose: schools, research labs, living quarters, symbolizing the empire's growth. Pausing beneath a towering statue that had once been a crumbling relic, Kael let out a reflective sigh. When I first came here, I was just a debt collector trying to pick up some last asset for the syndicate. He laughed softly. Never thought that asset would be you. Elyra's eyes sparkled with fond amusement. And I never imagined that the harbinger of my family's prophecy would be a cynic in a battered starship, she teased. They shared a gentle laugh, a testament to how far they had come. Looking out across the city below, Kael felt an unfamiliar contentment. He remembered his old life of chasing debts, living in the shadows, carrying a hardened heart. That man had been transformed by a chance encounter, an accident of fate, or perhaps a destiny written in starlight centuries ago. He squeezed Elyra's hand, grateful that the galaxy, for all its perils, had led him here. In the days that followed, representatives from dozens of star systems visited Orion, drawn by curiosity and the prospect of alignment with House Varnas's benevolent rule. Treaties were signed, trade routes established, and cultural exchanges flourished. Elyra presided with poise, assisted by Kael's no-nonsense approach to security and diplomacy. The once fearsome war drones now served primarily as peacekeepers, a visible sign that this empire would protect its people rather than oppress them. On a particularly festive evening, an anniversary of Orion's liberation, music filled the Citadel halls. Delegates from all corners of the galaxy sampled culinary delights in a grand banquet. Elyra wore robes combining her ancestral style with modern elegance, the scepter of Eunice displayed in a ceremonial cradle, a reminder of the Empire's storied past. Kael, dressed in a tailored uniform that bore a refined version of the hawk crest, greeted guests with surprising ease. Somehow, the once ruthless collector had become a figure of respect, even admiration. Late into the night, as the celebration wound down, Kael and Elyra found a quiet alcove beneath stained-glass windows depicting scenes from House Varnas's ancient glory. Elyra leaned against him, content. "They are calling you Emperor Kael now," she said teasingly. "Does that still feel strange?" He shrugged with a soft chuckle. "A bit, but I guess it's better than Kael the Collector." Elyra smiled in agreement. Then her expression grew thoughtful. "I feel them, you know," she said, glancing at the scepter. "The hopes of the people here, the echoes of the past. My ancestors dreamed of a united galaxy. Maybe it's not impossible, just takes a different kind of ruler." Kael brushed a strand of hair from her face. "We'll build it together, not through fear or conquest, but by showing we can give people something worth believing in." She nodded, a warm glow in her eyes, and pressed a gentle kiss to his lips. In that moment, everything felt right. Amid the galaxy's chaos, they had found belonging, purpose, and love. Thus, under the star-flecked sky of a planet once lost to time, an ancient empire rose anew, guided by two souls bound by fate and conviction. For all the threats that might lurk in distant corners of the cosmos, Orion shone as a promise of hope, a testament that even from the darkest depths and the coldest stasis pods, a grand destiny could emerge. And, as legends would one day tell, the emperor and empress who ruled from that citadel did so not with an iron fist, but with open hands and a compassionate heart, proving that the greatest power in all the stars was the one shared freely among those who dared to dream of peace. Happy endings rarely come without challenges, yet on Orion, that evening, the galaxy glimpsed that happiness, like the light of distant suns, might indeed be within reach. And so the story concludes, with the final debt of House Varnas paid not in coin, but in the promise of a brighter future, and the indomitable bond between Kael and Elyra, emperor and empress of a destiny neither had sought, yet both fully embraced.